so I'm not going to sugarcoat it. If you're not using Vagrant in your workflow already, you need to. And Sebastian's going to show you why and how. So please give him a warm round of applause.
Thank you, Ross. Welcome, everybody. This is my talk about Vagrant. But before we start, I must introduce my juggling style, because I started practicing juggling a little bit, and I told myself I will clearly juggle for an audience. So here we go. And when you start juggling, you realize you start with a cascade, and it takes some time, but it's pretty easy. And then you do something like a, see, reverse cascade, whoop, and then you go on and on. And sometimes, when I was just practicing a bit, I realized, well, that it's a little bit like programming, because you start small and you start just exploring stuff. You don't know really what you're doing, but it works. And then you fail and you try another one. And there are simple building blocks. Some building blocks you need, like there is a shower where you just throw the balls very high and catch them and do a clap in between or something like this. And you need this to start juggling 5 balls. So it's a pretty much a recommended building block. And that's what Vagrant is for programming. So you don't need to get started for programming, but when you hit some walls, it's a good idea to have something in place, like Vagrant. And one of the things, or one of the problems you encounter in programming is there is a bug happening on a production server or a testing server or whatever, and you say, it works on my machine. And your colleague's like, yeah, but it doesn't work on my machine, or it doesn't work in production. And you try to figure out why this is. And the most problem is when it's failing in production, of course. And there is another thing, like you're joining a new company or you want to get set up for a new project, and it's like, hey, it's everything in a setup and B. Just look it up, and there is like a hell of a text there, and you do all this, but it doesn't really work. Because somebody forgets some simple step, or there is not specified on which port MySQL has to run, and then you're looking for the code and have to run it. And my personal story is I worked for a company, and for half a year, I couldn't get JBoss running the right without throwing any errors. So it was like, what the fuck? How am I supposed to work if I'm not getting a development environment which works? And to get a development environment that works, there is Vagrant. So Vagrant is there to create and configure lightweight, reproducible, and portable development environments. And that's pretty much what it does. So you install it locally, and you have your virtual machine running in the background. It executes your code. For example, your web server, Nginx, Apache, whatever, your MySQL database, MongoDB, we heard about Cassandra today, you can run Cassandra in there. And your code lives on your host machine, and you share the code with the virtual machine through a shared folder, pretty much like a sync folder for VirtualBox. And that's why you can use your IDE locally on your host machine, your favorite IDE, VI, or I don't know, WebStorm, PHPStorm, IntelliJ, whatever there is. So let's look into Vagrant a bit. The major building blocks for Vagrant are the configuration, the providers, the provisioners, and the plugins. And they all together form what we call Vagrant. So it's really like many small steps to get your Vagrant where it is. So what's a configuration? The configuration is a simple configuration file, which is a Ruby DSL. So if you know Ruby, you're pretty familiar with this. If you're not into Ruby yet, then you should. And it's not that hard. So you see here a simple configuration file where you tell Vagrant what your box name is. You configure some IP for your private network, what your sync folders are, and here I have some chef configuration which I'll talk later, but you're simply telling what to execute when booting up the virtual machine. You have some providers, so Vagrant itself is not doing any virtualization. That's not what it does. It utilizes other providers, which is called, for example, VirtualBox or VMware. You got Hyper-V since the latest Vagrant release, 1.6, I think. And Hyper-V is, of course, only working on Windows machines. And you even got Docker, which we heard about before, and you got many else. Then there are the provisioners. So this is also something Vagrant is not doing on itself. So in order to configure your virtual machine, you can utilize, again, any of these provisioners. So for example, Chef and Puppet and Ansible. And there are many more. So what you do is you write, like you would write your configuration for a server, for example, Chef or Puppet. You just write your Chef cookbooks or your Puppet manifests or your Ansible playbooks. And instead of executing them on your server park, you execute them on your local virtual machine. And these are, I think, mostly all of them are supported out of the box, but there are many more which you can use, which is mostly done through plugins, which I will talk about later. I also talked about sync folders. So sync folders are nothing more like shared folders. Like you have your host folder somewhere with the code in it, and you share this with your virtual machine. Sorry, in order to not have them like copying over every time or even working inside the virtual machine to edit your code, because then you would be restricted if you're running it headless, which you should, because it's much of a performance gain. Then you would be restricted to using VI or Emacs or something, and that's not what you want to do. Or maybe you want to, but then it's also easier to have it on your host and not care about all the setup and everything. So I talked about, no, didn't talk about this yet. But in order to get into the box and execute some comments, there is just Vagrant SSH. So you can SSH into the box. You don't even need to use this. It's just a virtual machine running on running SSH server on port 22. So you can just use the IP if you remember it, if you set it up correctly. Vagrant SSH will know about the IP out of the box, so don't even need to care about this. And there are some plugins. Vagrant is built in order to everything, the providers, the provisioners, everything also can be realized through plugins. So it's really like you can extend it in every dimension. If you want some crazy virtualization nobody else uses, you can write a plugin for this. If you have some provisioning you want to use, which is not supported yet, you write a plugin for this. And there are also some other plugins, like taking screenshots inside the VM if you're not running it headless, getting some logs out of it, for example, or whatever there is. There is a plugin for managing host files, if you want to juggle with this, and many, many more. So, what's the basic workflow if you're just starting out with Vagrant and you're really eager to go and you're like, Sebastian really told me great stuff, so now I want to use it. Yeah, you're just doing a Vagrant. Of course, you need to install Vagrant and, for example, VirtualBox. Then you do a Vagrant init with a box name. There is a repository for base boxes, where you can just use them, or you create a new one, which is a little bit more complicated and most of the time not needed. So the hashing code is pretty much the standard same thing you want to use in the beginning. So you're doing a Vagrant init, which just creates a Vagrant file. Then you're doing a Vagrant app. The box is booting, everything is fine. Most an open source project, you can ship a Vagrant setup. So you don't longer need to tell people who want to test your code, who want to contribute to your code, yeah, you need to install this and this and this and make sure this is there and this is fair and stuff like this. You say, here's a Vagrant box, use it for developing or testing. Everything is set up, you don't need to care. If there are some updates, you can do a git pull and are good to go again. So this takes away the hassle of actually wanting to start doing open source. Well, what about Chef versus Puppet versus Ansible? What should I use when I use Vagrant? When I want to get started with Vagrant? And to be honest, it doesn't really matter. Choose what you like. I mean, obviously you should choose Ansible because it's looking very but Chef is also good. I like Chef very much. I also like Ansible. I don't like Puppet. But that's just a philosophical question, especially for local virtual machines. Because it's not much, it doesn't have that much impact on your local setup than it has when you're running 100 production servers. What about one box versus many boxes? I get this asked a lot. Shall I do one box where all my projects run in, or many boxes with one for each project? And that really depends. If you have a company and everybody's really working on the same stuff, maybe somebody's doing a little bit more of this project and a little less of this project, it makes sense to put it in one folder or in one virtual machine. If you have many distributed teams or teams which are working on really isolated stuff and they only need one part of it, it may be faster to not have a virtual machine which has every project configured, but only one. But this also depends on your dependencies for the project, because if you are doing a big Cassandra setup and only 5% of the people are using it, maybe it makes sense to put it in some extended virtual machine and not have it in the big main one. And what about base boxes? I talked about base boxes. These are the foundation for Vagrant setup, so you download them. It's like a VirtualBox export. And people ask me, how do I create them? What should I put in there? And I'm like, go with the HashiCorp one. Just take the base one. There is nothing installed. It's a plain Ubuntu, and it works, and you can install everything with your provisioner. So there is no need to put Nginx inside the base box. There is no need to put a MySQL database in there. You can do everything with provisioners, and you are much more flexible because you can reuse the box for everything. Because if you create a new box and you put Cassandra in there, and you don't have Nginx in there because you don't need it actually. And that's really cool. Of course, you will hit some point where you have such a long setup. I once had a Sphinx setup where I downloaded the whole LaTeX suite, which is 1 gigabyte, and it took like 1 hour. And maybe that's something, if you really need it, maybe that's something you put into your base box, because it really takes a long time, and nobody wants to wait that long. But for the normal use cases, it's pretty okay to use a standard base box and not really care about it. And what about performance? I mean, Vagrant has a reputation for being slow, and actually it's not really Vagrant which is slow, but the virtual machine itself. And I go with VirtualBox, and it's not that slow for a small project. If you have bigger projects, then you need to take some steps for not being slow. For example, you can try to not write to shared folders. Like if you're caching stuff, you should write them inside the virtual machine to some temp folder or something. Because writing on a shared folder is really expensive with VMware. With VirtualBox. Then there is VMware, which costs a bit, so it has a price tag to it, but it's much faster. So if you really hit some performance issues, you should use VMware. Invest the money and you're to go. Don't say, I heard Vagrant is slow, so I'm not going to use it, because that's a really bad trade-off. And of course, you can try different shared folder strategies. There are like syncing with AirSync and everything, which makes things a little bit faster, but you have to play around with it. And of course, there's also many setup things you can try to improve upon. And of course, when you're doing a Vagrant boot and it's really slow, you have time to actually do some sword fighting or some catching up with your colleagues, getting a coffee and everything. So the Vagrant boot time should not concern you really, because the provisioning, so when you have really long provisioning, because you're installing crazy stuff, it's not really that much of a problem because you don't do this regularly. I mean, I do it like once a week maybe to ensure that everything is up to date with my provisioners, but once a week waiting for, 15 minutes for everything to boot up. You can do it before your first coffee on Monday morning, then you chat a little bit with your coworkers, and when you get back to your machine, everything is booted up and working, and that's pretty good. And for the rest of the week, you just don't destroy your box, you're just booting it up. And when you're booting it up, it doesn't provision anymore, because you must explicitly say provision again. And normally you don't need it, because I expect most production environments to be pretty stable, so the development environment shouldn't change often. Of course, they'll change more often, but not that often. And that concludes my talk about Vagrant, which really, when you take something away from here, when you're going home, you say, well, the juggling was awesome, but what else was there? Then Vagrant really makes development environments easy, and it's really like one of the best tools I encountered when developing. Thank you very much. And sorry for my voice. Questions?
Yeah, hi. So I have a question. Did you ever encounter a situation when you create a Vagrant file and when you do a Vagrant top, it works on your machine, but it doesn't work on some other machine?
Well, this can happen, of course, because, for example, one thing that comes to mind is that if you use plugins, you need these plugins to be installed on the other machine as well. Then you sometimes, at least in the old ones, you had some problems with specific operation systems, especially Windows, which, I mean, Vagrant works with Windows, and right now it works pretty well. But there may be some problems. But normally, no. As soon as the box boots up, it's a virtual box running, or a VMware box running, and from this point on, there shouldn't be any issues. Maybe there is an issue, for example, there was an issue with Windows 7 and VirtualBox, where under some circumstances, it couldn't boot any boxes. And this might be the case, for example, but that's really not specific for Vagrant, but actually for VirtualBox, because there was something missing. I had this problem once, I don't remember it really, but usually it's not the Vagrant problem. But of course, it can happen.
I have a question. I installed Vagrant and run one box. And I'm interested how to put it to another user to the most easiest way. How can it run up those configurations with the files?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't really get it.
Okay. I installed the Vagrant on my local machine, installed the box and configured it in some configuration. What is the easiest way for other person to deploy that machine?
To deploy that machine?
Yes, to run it. You said that your project manager can easily, and I would like to know what is this way that some other non-geek guy can run up the configuration.
Yeah, the easiest way is Git. Put your configuration and your provision and everything in Git, not the VM with the virtual machine itself, but the Vagrant file and all the files you need for provisioning, put it in Git, put it on GitHub or wherever, and the person checks out the repository and works with this configuration.
Does the person need to install Vagrant?
Yeah, of course, but that's a prerequisite. So you need to install Vagrant to run a Vagrant box.
Okay, thank you.
If you don't want to install anything, you would need some, I don't know, server environment where you would run these boxes. You can do this, but this is not really, Vagrant was not really done to run on servers. It was done to power your development environment locally. But to install Vagrant, it's on Windows, for example, it's an exe file, or you find it in apt and in Yum and everywhere, so it's not, I think installing Vagrant is the easy part.
You mentioned that we can develop in Vagrant by using our own configuration. For example, some configuration like text editor or some scripts that we use. How exactly do we use it? If we SSH into Vagrant and then we get its own.
Yeah, this is done through the shared folders. So the idea is you have your shared folder on your host machine, not inside your VirtualBox. So for example, your project is in some directory, and this lives on your host machine. And you change the code through your IDE like you would if everything would run on your host. And it's shared with the virtual machine, and the code is executed inside your virtual machine. So for example, you would install Nginx, and let's make it easy, PHP, in the virtual machine, and have your Nginx set up to listen on some port, and have some port forwarding or something like this. And your code would live on your host machine. You would take PHP storm, edit some files, and refresh the web page. And instead of hitting the Nginx on your host machine, it hits the Nginx in your virtual machine. And this takes the shared folder and executes the code in it like you configured it. And of course, you can have specific configuration inside your virtual machine if you want to. That's a bit more complicated, but it can be done.
I have one question only. I have a mass of physical servers that I manage, and I would like to have a script that would pull up the configuration and create the Vagrant file, the config RB, and all the stuff that is needed to boot up that box. Is such stuff exists? Because physical to virtual I can do, but physical to Vagrant, no.
Yeah, not really. So you need, for each of the providers, so your base box needs to be an image for example, VirtualBox. So you need your VirtualBox stuff. So what you could try, but I don't think it's really possible to extract the configuration from your bare metal server into some provisioning. for example, Chef or Puppet, but I actually never heard of it, so I don't think it's really doable. And I don't even think there is a way to, for example, what you would need to do is you need to take your server and make a VirtualBox machine out of it. Because that's what you need to do, and I don't think there is a way. I'm sorry. Well, if it's a VirtualBox, then maybe you can boot it. If you're in VirtualBox, then you have solved the problem, because then you can, it's actually, you can just export the box, and from that point on, Vagrant can use it.
Yes, there is a way to do that, by the way. We use another project of Hashimoto Corp to build our Vagrant boxes the same way that we build our servers and virtual Packer.
Okay. But Packer can do from a running server, take the configuration into.
No, we just basically use the same way that we set up our servers with Pre-Seed and with Puppet to build the images and then extract them to different formats like, I don't know, VirtualBox, EC2, etc.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.